process. And so sitting behind all of these activities is data, and hopefully good data, okay? Because, and we'll talk a bit more about this, the way when we come to integrate scientific and environmental data in with economic and social, sometimes it's difficult if the data's not very good to do that on equal footing, okay? So if you looked at this area and you're thinking about especially the environmental impacts of the pineapple farms with its nutrient runoff, you're thinking about the forestry here, which they also put some fertiliser on. First of all, what might be some of the impacts, some of the other impacts? So I've talked about fertiliser into the water. What other impacts might there be that you as newly fledged scientists might need to monitor and assess?
The runoff and the way it's flowing to the land, so if it like moves all the soil and could like have like land capture and stuff.
Yep, okay, so you're talking about water quality in terms of runoff, there's sediment there, which is also really important. So if you look in the forestry blocks here, you'll see that all these trees that they've ploughed the ground, and they're all on sort of slightly raised rows. So there would have been some sort of sediment loss, especially when they were doing that. Okay. What else might you be watching for?
Habitat fragmentation. Much more prevalent in estimated vegetation.
Exactly, yeah. So, and if you look at an aerial map, it's not always even continuous along the creek. So you might have fragmentation, and what might that mean if there's fragmentation?
Low biodiversity, species are able to travel in between.
Yeah, good. So especially koalas, they're not an edge species, so they need that continuity of habitat, or they can run across open spaces, but they can't go too far, and then there's threats from dogs and other things like that. Okay, so fragmentation, that's another good one that we might be monitoring for, and thinking about the policy and the legislation that's in place. Anyone doing an economic activity that is going to impact on koalas is going to have to show how they're minimising that impact. That's going to be one of the requirements of any impact assessment. What else might you have happening through here that you have to watch?
Topsoil erosion.
Yes, so that's the topsoil erosion, and then the sediment getting into the water. Yep. So on that, it's interesting when we're talking about connectivity, fragmentation. So we talk about how fragmented or how connected the landscape is. And so here, the reverse, I guess a corridor along a river is also a buffer. Okay, so when we're talking about impacts on the river, that vegetation is also buffering the river from some of the sediment there. So we might monitor on how well this vegetation is buffering the pine plantation here, and whether there needs to be a wider buffer in terms of the way this land is managed. Great. What else can you see when you look around here? Look at the trunks of some of these trees. Fire. Yeah. So why do you think there might be fire here? There's a few reasons. Can you think of any? Good, yeah. So there is some fire management that happens here. For those of you who aren't aware, in a lot of native forests, Australian forests would naturally burn, and Indigenous people would also burn them regularly. So it's a landscape that's used to being burnt, and it actually helps to maintain the biodiversity in this area if it has low-level burns every few years. So perhaps the the Department of Environment people have done some burns here. What might be some of the risks that we would need to manage in terms of doing burns in this area?
It should be like a rotation. Just can't burn all the area together.
Yeah, good. Yep. So it needs to be controlled burns in small spaces. So if we're talking about biodiversity, that becomes interesting. That means we'll probably do it in winter. So you'll see, if you haven't been in Brisbane in September before, and you get asthma like me, keep your puffer close in September. There'll be controlled burns happening when the forest is damp, which isn't naturally when it would happen. And so this can have effects on the seeds that are here, because you get a steamy sort of fire rather than a hot, quick fire. But I also want you to think about the interface between the different land uses here. So what might happen, or what's a risk here if we're doing controlled burn for biodiversity here in the waterway in terms of the interface with other land uses? Yeah, pine forest. That's a huge investment here. So obviously forestry, you plant the crop, you then have to tend to it for a softwood plantation. You start thinning it about 11 years, and then you won't fully harvest it for like 15, 20 years. So for that whole time, your whole product is at risk from these sorts of activities. So what might you do in response if you were the pine? You're now a scientist working for the pine plantation, HQ plantations they're called. Well done on your new job. What might you do to do with this risk of fire? Yeah. So you might have a fire break. They also do fuel reduction burns in the forest as well. So what's interesting in terms of the science of this is that you might have controlled burns happening for the native vegetation. You're also having fire reduction burns in the pine forest, and both are potentially risks to the other that we might have to manage, that we might have to do science on. Okay, so basically you're looking at the fuel load on the ground in the forest, and they'll come through every now and again, and they'll burn that to avoid having enough fuel on the forest floor that if a forest fire did come through, the last thing, they just don't want it to get up into the crown and take out the whole tree. So what sort of data, as amazing scientists, are you going to recommend that we need to assess or monitor in terms of this? So there's a whole range of issues we've talked about. What would you want to be able to measure so that you could show decision makers that what might be going on in terms of the science of this landscape?
What kind of animals, like how many koalas around here and where they're located? So then when you do the burning, like controlled burning, then have to think about it, otherwise you're going to burn all the
Burn
koalas.
toasty koalas, yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. So this science can be used to inform the way management is done. What time of year, in what places, at what scale. If you have that data on fauna and flora and their movements. Not so much here, but in some parts of the world they will, if there's migratory species, there's certain times of the year that they won't do certain activities in urban or rural areas. If there are nesting species, then there's certain times of the year when they won't do particular activities. Good. So what other science might you recommend needs to be gathered here?
Monitoring the water flow, which way it naturally flows.
Yeah, good. So you want a good hydrology model of what's happening. You probably want to do some water quality testing as well at different times of the year, so that you know if there's any impact from the forestry. If you're the forestry people, you want to put one up near the pineapple plantation as well, so that you don't get blamed for things that might be coming out of a different economic activity. That's the last thing you want. If I was the forestry people, I'd also put one where the water comes out of the urban areas into this landscape as well, because a lot of chemicals are coming out now are coming out of urban areas too.
I saw a lot of signs about illegal dumping, but that sort of overlapping.
Perhaps not so much in terms of science, but in terms of costs and benefits, definitely. So there's a cost to running any sort of forestry operation involved with delinquency and keeping these areas safe, as well as cleaning up after any dumps that happen as well. So all of those things have to be factored into an economic cost analysis. The local government would be thinking a lot about that, because they don't want to have to then, because of any safety reasons, put in extra infrastructure around here. Okay, well, it sounds like you're becoming fantastic scientists now, and you're starting to think about how that science might come into the assessment of these sites, where they go. Oh, that's one thing that we didn't get to. I'll give you this information because without the background you won't know, but across Queensland we have mapping of our native vegetation, okay? So every ecosystem, we call them regional ecosystems, will have a particular number associated with it, associated with the bioregion that it's in. So we're in the southeast Queensland bioregion. Then there'll be another number associated with the soil type here. So here we're looking at a riparian sort of soil type, and then another one associated with the vegetation community that's here. So if you ever see RE and then 3 numbers with dots in between them, that's what that number is for. Each one of those regional ecosystems will have an assessment in terms of how endangered they are. So we might have not of concern, which means there's more than 30% of what was originally here before white colonialism. We might have of concern, which is between 10 and 30%, and then endangered. So I'm pretty sure that Melaleuca wetlands are now heading towards at least locally endangered, because most of this area would have originally been Melaleuca wetland forest. So when we're assessing whether we can even have this activity here in the first place, if there's an endangered ecosystem here, then they will need extra permission in order to do that. So as scientists, you want to make sure that this mapping is correct, that that regional ecosystem is listed correctly on this map. Because if it's not, they'll get development permission and they'll be allowed to just come in and clear it. As far as the law is concerned, if it's not on these regulated vegetation maps, it doesn't exist. So an economic activity can come in and clear it. Okay. Any other questions or comments on the scientific side of this, or policy and planning?
Is it part of any catchment area?
Yeah, good. Yes, so yes it is. Are you thinking in terms of thinking about the environmental, the data collection and that sort of thing?
If it's part of any catchment area, then there would be other aspects to take care of.
Sorry? Otherwise?
There would be other aspects to keep in mind.
Yeah, good. So this is actually one of these ways that we can integrate information, is at the landscape level we can look at the river catchment or even the bioregion if we want to go larger, and look at how all the different activities in that river catchment might be interacting. It's also a model, catchment management, that where you can bring together all the different stakeholders. So if we have, for example, some sort of limit on the water pollution coming out of this creek into the fish habitat area, and we're starting to push up towards that limit, we might get all the stakeholders together and say, what can we do about this? And try and make some decisions together around managing the catchment. Okay, excellent. We might get everyone back together then. And so what I want you to do is you're going to very democratically get somebody to feedback some of what we were talking about to the broader group. Okay? Perhaps someone who's confident speaking in English. We can have the translations later. Excellent. I'll just go and get this breakaway group.